Chapter 11. I'd often wondered what old Dan would do if little Ann got into some kind of a predicament. One night, I got my answer. For several days a northern blizzard had been blowing, and it was a bad one. The temperature dropped down to 10 below. The storm started with a slow, cold drizzle and then sleet. When the wind started blowing, everything froze, leaving the ground as slick as glass. Trapped indoors, I was as nervous as a fish out of water. I told Ma I guessed it was just going to storm all winter. She laughed and said, "I don't think it will, but it does look like it's going to last a while." She ruffled up my hair and kissed me betwixt the eyes, and this riled me up. I didn't like to be kissed like that. It seemed that I could practically rub my skin off and still feel it all wet and sticky and kind of burning. Sometime on the 5th night, the storm blew itself out and had snowed about 3 inches. The next morning, I went out to my doghouse. Scraping the snow away from the two-way door, I stuck my head in. It was as warm as an oven. I got my face washed all over by little Ann when old Dan's tail thumped out a tune on a wall. I told them to be ready, 'cause we were going hunting that night. I knew the old ringtails would be hungry and stirring, for they were denned up during the storm. That evening, as I was leaving the house, Pa said, "Billy, be careful tonight. It'll be slick down under that snow, and it'd be pretty easy to twist an ankle or even break a leg." I told him I would, and that I wouldn't be going far, just out back of our fields in the bottoms. "Well, anyway, be careful. There'll be no moon tonight, and you're going to see some fog next to the river." Walking through our fields, I saw that my father was right about being slick and dark. Several times I slipped and sat down, and I couldn't see anything beyond the glow of my lantern, but I wasn't worried. My light was a good one, and Ma had insisted that I make 2 leather pouches to cover the blades of my axe. Just before I reached the timber, old Dan shook the snow from the underbrush with his loud voice. I stopped and listened, and he bawled again, the deep bass tones rolling around the tall sycamores, tore their way out of the thick timbers and traveled out over the fields, and then slammed up against the foothills. There they would break up and die away in the mountains. Old Dan was working the trail slowly, and I knew why. He would never line out until little Ann was running by his side. I thought she would never get there, and when she did, her beautiful voice made the blood pound in my temples, and I felt the excitement of the hunt as it ate away into my body. Taking a deep breath, I reared back and whooped as loud as I could. The coon ran up river for a ways, and then, cutting out of the bottoms, he headed for the mountains. I stood and listened until their voices went out of hearing. Slipping and sliding, I started in the direction I'd last heard them. About halfway to the foothills, I heard them coming back. Somewhere in the rugged mountains, the coon had turned and headed back towards the river. It was about time for him to run out of tricks, and I was wondering what he would do next. I knew it would be hard for him to hide his trail with the snow on the ground. I realized later that the smart old coon knew this too. As the voices of my dogs grew louder, I could tell they were coming straight towards me. Once I started to blow out my lantern, thinking that maybe I could see them when they crossed our field, but I realized I didn't stand a chance of seeing the race in that skunk black night. Down in the mountains, they brought him, singing a hound dog song on his heels. The coon must have scented me or seen my lantern, because he cut to my right and ran between our house and me. I heard screaming and yelling from my sisters, and my father started a whooping. I knew my whole family was out on the porch, listening to the beautiful voices of my little red hounds. I felt as tall as the tallest sycamore on the river bank, and I yelled as loud as I could. Again I heard the squealing of my sisters and the shouts of my father. The "ours" of old Dan and the sharp "ar" of little Ann bore a hole in the inky black night. The vibrations rolled and quivered in the icy silence. The coon was heading for the river. I could tell my dogs were crowding him and wondered if he would make it to the water, and I was hoping he wouldn't, for I didn't want to wade the cold water unless I had to. I figured the old coon had a reason for turning and coming back to the river, and I wondered what trick he had in his mind. I remembered something my grandfather had said. He said, "Never underestimate the cunningness of an old river coon. When the nights are dark and the ground is frozen and slick, they can pull some mean tricks on a hound. Sometimes the tricks can be fatal." I was halfway through the fog-covered bottoms when the voices of my dogs stopped. I stood still, waiting and listening. A cold silence settled over the bottoms. I could hear the snap and the crack of the sap-frozen limbs. From far back in the flinty hills, the long, lonesome howl of a timber wolf floated down into the silent light. Across the river, I heard a cow moo. I knew the sound was coming from Laurie's place. Not being able to hear the voices of my dogs gave me an uncomfortable feeling. I whooped and waited for one of them to bawl. And as I waited, I realized something was different in the bottoms. Something was missing. I wasn't worried about my dogs. I figured that the coon had pulled some trick and sooner or later they would unravel the trail. But the feeling that something just wasn't right had me worried. I whooped several more times and still got no answer. Stumbling, slipping and sliding, I started on, reaching the river. I realized it was frozen over. I realized what my strange, uneasy feeling was. I had not been able to hear the sound of the water. As I stood listening, I heard it gurgling out in the middle. The river wasn't frozen all the way across. The still, eddy waters next to the banks were frozen, but out in the middle where the current was swift, the water was running, leaving a trough in the ice pack. The gurgling sound I had heard was the swift current as it sucked its way through the channel. The last time I'd heard my dogs, they were downstream from me, walking on, listening. I hadn't gone very far when I heard old Dan. What I heard froze the blood in my veins. He wasn't bawling on the trail or giving the tree bark. It was one long, continuous cry. In his deep voice there seemed to be a pleading cry for help. Scared, worried, and with my heart beating like a churn dasher, I started towards the sound. I almost passed him, but with another cry he let me know where he was. He was out on the ice pack. I couldn't see him for the fog, and I called to him, and he answered with a low whine, and again I called his name. This time he came to me. He wasn't the same dog. His tail was between his legs, and his head was bowed down, and he stopped about 7 feet from me. Sitting down on the ice, he raised his head and howled the most mournful cry I had ever heard. Turning around, he trotted back out on the ice and then disappeared into the fog. I knew something had happened to little Ann. I called her name, and she answered with a pleading cry. Although I couldn't see her, I had guessed what had happened. The coon had led them to the river. Running out onto the ice, he leapt across the trough. My dogs, hot on the trail, had followed. Old Dan, a more powerful dog than Little Ann, had made his leap. Little Ann hadn't made it. Her small feet had probably slipped on the slick ice and she had fallen into the icy water. Old Dan, seeing the fate of his little friend, had quit the chase and come back to help her. The smart old coon had pulled his trick, and a deadly one it was. I had to do something. She would never be able to get out by herself. It was only a matter of time until her body was paralyzed by the freezing water. Laying my axe down, I held my lantern out in front of me and then stepped out onto the ice. It started cracking and popping, and I jumped back onto the bank. Although it was thick enough to hold the light weight of my dogs, it would never hold me. Little Ann started whining and begging for help. I went all to pieces and started crying. Something had to be done and done quickly or my little dog was lost. I thought of running for home, for a rope, or for my father, but I knew she couldn't last until I got back. I was desperate. It was impossible for me to swim in that freezing water. I wouldn't last for a minute. She cried again, begging for one thing I couldn't give her: help. I thought, if I could only see her, maybe I could figure out some way I could help. Looking at my lantern gave me an idea. I ran up to the bank about 30 feet, turned and looked back. I could see the light, not well, but enough for what I had in mind. I grabbed my lantern and axe and ran for the bottoms. I was looking for a stand of wild cane. After what seemed like ages, I found one. With the longest one I could find, I hurried back. After it was trimmed and the limber end cut off, I hung the lantern by the handle on the end and started easing it out onto the ice. I saw old Dan first. He was sitting close to the edge of the trough, looking down. And then I saw her. Oh, I groaned at her plight. All I could see was her head and her small front paws. Her claws were spread out and digging into the ice. She knew that if she ever lost that hold, she was gone. Old Dan raised his head and howled. Hound though he was, he knew it was the end of the trail for his little pal. I wanted to get my light as close as I could to little Ann as I could, but my pole was a good 8 foot short. Setting the lantern down, I eased the pole from under the handle. I thought, well, I'm no better off than I was before. In fact, I'm worse. Now I can see where the end comes. Little Ann cried again, and I saw her claws slip on the ice. Her body settled lower into the water. Old Dan howled and started fidgeting. He knew the end was close. I didn't exactly know when I started towards my dog. I had taken only 2 steps when the ice broke. I twisted my body and fell towards the bank, and just as my hand closed upon a root, I thought my feet touched bottom, but I wasn't sure. As I pulled myself out, I felt the numbing cold sweep over my legs. It looked so hopeless. There didn't seem to be any way I could save her. At the edge of the ice stood a large sycamore. I got behind it, anything to blot out the heartbreaking scene. Little Ann, thinking I'd deserted her, started crying, and I couldn't stand it, and I opened my mouth to call old Dan. I wanted to tell him to come on, and we'd go home, as there was nothing we could do. The words, they just wouldn't come out. I couldn't utter a sound. I lay my face against the icy cold bark of the sycamore, and I thought of the prayer that I'd said when I asked God to help me to get 2 hound pups. I knelt down and sobbed out a prayer. I asked for a miracle which would save the life of my little dog. I promised all the things that a young boy could, if only he'd help me. Still saying my prayer and making promises, I heard a sharp, metallic click. I jumped up and stepped away from the tree. I was sure the noise I'd heard was made by a rattling chain on the front end of a boat. I shouted as loud as I could. Over here! I need help! My dog is drowning! I waited for an answer. All I could hear were the cries of little Ann. Again I hollered. Over here on the bank! Can you see my light? I need help! Hurry! I held my breath waiting for an answering shout. Shivering from the freezing cold of my wet shoes and overalls, a strained silence settled over the river. A feathery rustle swished by in the darkness. A flock of low-flying geese had been disturbed by my loud shouting, and I strained my ears for some sound. Now and then I could hear the lapping sound of the ice-cold waters that swirled its way through the trough. I glanced at little Ann. She was still holding on, but I saw her paws were just at the edge, and I knew her time was short. I couldn't figure out what I had heard. The sound was made by metal striking metal, but what was it? What could have caused it? I looked at my axe. It couldn't have been the sound, as it was too close to me. The sound had come from out on the river. When I looked at my lantern, I knew it was what had made the strange sound. I had left the handle standing straight up when I had taken the pole away, and now it was down. For some unknown reason, the stiff wire handle had twisted in its sockets and had dropped. As it had fallen, it had struck the metal frame, making the sharp metallic sound I had heard. As I stared at the yellow glow of my light, the last bit of hope faded away, and I closed my eyes, intending to pray again for the help that I so desperately needed. And then, like a blinding red flash, the message of the lantern bore its way into my brain. There was my miracle. There was the way to save my little dog. In the metallic sound I had heard, they were my instructions. They were so plain I couldn't help but understand them. The bright yellow flame started flickering and dancing. It seemed to say, "Hurry, you know what to do." Faster than I'd ever worked in my life, I went to work. With a stick I measured the water in the hole where my feet had broken through the ice. I was right. My feet had touched bottom. 18 inches down, I felt the soft mud. With my pole, I fished the lantern back to the bank. I took the handle off and straightened it out and bent a hook in one end. With one of my shoelaces, I tied the wire to the end of the cane pole. I left the hook sticking out about 6 inches beyond the end of it. I started shouting encouragement to little Ann. I told her to hang on and not give up. I was going to save her, and she answered with a low cry. With hook stuck in one of the ventilated holes in the top of my light, I lifted it back out onto the ice and set it down. After a little wiggling and pushing, I worked the hook loose and laid the pole down. I took off my clothes, picked up my axe, and started out into the hole in the icy water. It came up to my knees, and step by step, breaking the ice with my axe, I waded out. The water then came up to my hips, and then my waist. The cold bite of it took my breath away, and I felt my body grow numb. I couldn't feel my feet at all, but I knew they were moving. When the water reached my armpits, I stopped and worked my pole toward the land. Stretching my arms as far out as I could still see I was about a foot short. Closing my eyes and gritting my teeth, I moved on. The water reached my chin. I was close enough. I started hooking onto the collar of little Ann, and time after time I felt the hook almost catch. I saw I was fishing at the wrong angle. She was settled so low into the water I couldn't reach her collar. Raising my arms above my head so that the pole could be at a slant, I kept hooking and praying. The seconds ticked by. I strained for one more inch, and the muscles of my arms grew numb from the weight of the pole, and little Ann's claws slipped again. I thought she was gone. At the very edge of the ice, she caught again. All I could see now was her red paws and her nose and her eyes. Old Dan's actions, I could tell he understood and wanted to help. He ran over close to my pole and started digging at the ice. I whopped him with the cane. That was the only time in my life I ever hit my dog. I had to get him away so that I could see what I was doing. Just when I thought my task was impossible, I felt the hook slide under the tuft of leather. It was none too soon. As gently as I could, I dragged her over the rim of the ice. At first I thought she was dead. She didn't move. Old Dan started whining. Licking her face and ears, she moved her head. I started talking to her. She made an effort to stand but couldn't. Her muscles were paralyzed and the blood had long since ceased to flow. At the movement of little Ann, old Dan threw a fit. He started barking and jumping, his long red tail fanning the air. Still holding on to my pole, I tried to take a step backwards. My feet wouldn't move. A cold, gripping fear came over me. I thought my legs were frozen. I made another effort to lift my leg. It moved. I realized that my feet were stuck in the soft, muddy bottom. I started backing out, dragging the body of my little dog. I couldn't feel the pole in my hands. When my feet touched the icy bank, I couldn't feel that either. All the feeling in my body was gone. I wrapped little Ann in my coat and hurried into my clothes, and with the pole I fished my light back. Close by was a large drift, and I climbed upon the top of it and dug a hole down through the ice and snow until I reached some dry limbs. I poured half the oil of my lantern down into that hole and then dropped in a match, and in no time I had a roaring fire. I laid little Ann down close to the warm heat and then went to work. Old Dan washed her head with his warm red tongue while I massaged and rubbed her body. I could tell by her cries when the blood started circulating. Little by little her strength came back, and I stood her on her feet and started walking her. She was weak and wobbly, but I knew she would live, and I felt much better and then breathed a sigh of relief. After drying myself off best as I could, I took the lantern handle from the pole, bent it back to its original position, and then put it back on the lantern. Holding the light out in front of me, I looked at it. The bright metal gleamed in the firelight glow. I started talking to it. I said, "Thanks, old lantern. More than you'll ever know. I'll always take care of you. Your globe will be clean, and there'll never be a speck of rust or dust on your frame." I knew if it had not been for the miracle of my lantern, my little dog would have met her death on that night. Her grave would have been the cold, icy waters of the Illinois River. Out in the river, I could hear the cold water gurgling in the icy trough, and it seemed to be angry. It hissed and growled as it tore its way through the channel, and I shuddered to think what might have happened. Before I left for home, I walked back to the sycamore tree. Once again I said a prayer, but this time the words were different. I didn't ask for a miracle. In every way a young boy could, I said thanks. My second prayer wasn't just words, it was all my heart and soul poured into it. On my way home, I decided not to say anything to my mother and father about little Ann's accident. I knew it would scare Ma and she might stop my hunting. Reaching our house, I didn't hang the lantern in its usual place. I took it up to my room and set it in a corner with the handle standing up. Next morning, I started sneezing and come down with a terrible cold. I told Ma I must have got my feet wet. She scolded me a little and started doctoring me. For 3 days and nights I stayed home. All this time, I kept checking the handle of the lantern. My sisters shook the house from roof to floor with their playing and romping, but that handle never did fall. I went to my mother and asked her if God answers prayers every time one was said. She smiled and said, "No, Billy, not every time. He only answers ones that are said from the heart. You have to be sincere and believe in him." She asked why I had wanted to know. "Oh, I was just wondering. Just wanted to know." She came over and straightened my suspenders. "Well, that's a very nice question for my little Daniel Boone to ask." Bending over, she started kissing me. Well, I finally squirmed away from her, feeling as wet as a dirt dauber's nest. My mother could never kiss me like a fella should be kissed. Before she was done, I was kissed all over. It always made me feel silly and baby-like. I tried to tell her that a coon hunter wasn't supposed to be kissed that way, but Ma didn't seem to understand things like that. Well, I stomped out of the house to see how my dogs were. End of chapter 11.